Welcome to the University of Illinois Extension's Local Government Education webinar. We are happy to welcome on Eryn Hurley, who is joining us during her DC lunch hour. Thank you so much. Eryn is the Director of the National Association of Counties Government Affairs Department. She assists in legislative and executive branch outreach and advocacy of the association's legislative priorities and policy development. She also specializes in monitoring the implementation of the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund and the American Rescue Plan Act Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund at the local level. We really appreciate that expertise, Eryn, and we are so very grateful because you have consistently revisited us annually over the past few years to provide us updates on federal legislation. And today we're happy to have you on as we're finishing up this year to focus a little bit on the Treasury's new guidance with ARPA and how language can be interpreted in those provisions and key points around eligible uses. So thank you so much for being so giving of your time to let counties know how they might be impacted and other useful information. And before I hand it over to you, I just want to say hi to Laura and thank Laura to let her say a few words about Rural Partners and go ahead and hand it over to Eryn, our main presenter today.
Thanks, Nancy. I first wanted to thank U of I Extension for working with us on this webinar series. Rural Partners is happy to be a partner. If you're not familiar with Rural Partners, we're a not-for-profit. We are the state's Rural Development Council. We've got a great board, volunteer working board that tries to connect people with resources, and we try to get information out. We've got a great newsletter that's sent out weekly. If you're not on that, please let us know. We'd be happy to add you. Please, we have a website. We'll put a link in the chat. Please check us out and see if you'd be interested in being a member and getting involved with our organization. Again, we're happy to be partners with University of Illinois Extension on this webinar series. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Eryn and ditto what Nancy said on thank you for doing this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nancy and Laura, for that introduction and for, of course, inviting me to be here today. I hope everyone's having a great week so far. So as Nancy mentioned, I'm going to be running through some of the recently released guidance from the U.S. Department of Treasury regarding the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which, of course, was authorized by the American Rescue Plan Act and provided $65.1 billion in direct funding to every single county, parish, and borough across the United States. So before we kind of get into those eligible uses, just want to provide folks with a little bit of background. So this new guidance came out as a result of when Congress passed their fiscal year 2023 omnibus package. So this was back in December of 2020. As part of that larger package, there was something called the Cornyn-Padilla Amendment that was included in that package. So what that did, what it was is that it was just the amendment was used to be a standalone bill that was sponsored by Senators Cornyn and Padilla. It was bipartisan. It allowed counties and any recipients to invest in service transportation, disaster relief, and then Title I or community development block grant projects. So because that amendment was included in that larger omnibus package, ultimately then it was signed into law, and then Treasury finally released their new guidance. So that's just some background information. In addition to talking about these new eligible uses, I'm also going to touch on where we are in terms of government funding and the current status of electing a new Speaker of the House, and then also wanted to provide an update on a new regulation called Waters of the United States that does impact counties all across the country. So just really quickly, just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of NACo's new resources that we have regarding this new guidance that Treasury released. If you scan that QR code on the right side of the screen, that'll take you directly to our analysis page. So you can, find everything that I'm going to be covering in this presentation and more. Also here, of course, Treasury has also released their the actual interim final rule. It's a little over 200 pages. If you don't want to read that entire thing, which I don't blame you, they also have an overview of the interim final rule, which is around 20 pages. That's very helpful. So now let's talk about kind of an overview of this new interim final rule. So I do want to stress on this slide that, and you all are very much aware of this, that under the 2022 final rule that Treasury released, that was like the original American Rescue Plan Act, there were 4 eligible use categories that counties could invest these ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds in. So those 4: replacing any sort of lost revenue, addressing the public health or negative economic impacts, providing premium pay to essential workers, and then investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So when we're talking about this new guidance that was released, this interim final rule, I want to stress that those 4 categories do not change at all. Counties should continue investing funds as they were. If they were in these categories, don't even worry about it. Nothing changes, exactly the same eligible uses. Simply what this interim final rule does is that it adds 3 new eligible use categories for counties. So that's the emergency relief from natural disasters, the surface transportation projects, and then those Title I projects. And Title I projects are like eligible activities, programs under the Community Development Block Grant Program. So again, now in total, there's 7 in total eligible use categories instead of the original 4. So some of the top highlights for this new flexibility. So as I mentioned, these are just additional eligible uses. This new interim final rule does not alter any existing eligible uses that were outlined by that 2022 final rule in terms of when you can actually start covering expenses associated with this interim final rule. So counties can, cover any sort of costs that were incurred beginning December 29th of 2022. So it is a little bit later than the original costs for the 2022 final rule. So definitely just be wary of that. In terms of some other key highlights, this is really kind of all around the obligation and expenditure deadlines associated with the ARPA recovery fund. So with this new guidance that came out, the obligations deadline, which is when you actually have to, account for how you are spending the money, that obligation deadline remains the same, December 31st of 2024. Everything remains the same. If you decide to obligate your funds towards disaster relief, or spend your funds towards disaster relief in this new eligible use category, your expenditure date or your deadline also remains the same. So December 31st of 2026. The biggest change here is that if you decide to invest your funds in transportation or those Title I CDBG projects, your expenditure deadline moves up several months. So your new expenditure deadline is September 30th of 2026. So that's the big change here. It's really only if you spend the dollars in those 2 new eligible use categories that you have an expedited expenditure deadline. So if you are investing in natural disaster relief or in any of those 4 previously eligible use categories, those original ones, your expenditure deadline stays the exact same of December 31st of 2026. So again, that's just the major change here. And then also you are allowed to use recovery funds now under these new eligible use categories for the non-federal match for certain surface transportation projects, as well as for projects and activities under the CDBG program too. Besides the new non-federal match requirements that you can use the funds for, which are very explicit, we'll go over those. It doesn't add any sort of new eligible uses for non-federal match. So you're still very much so restricted in terms of how you can use those funds. So if you're using your revenue loss dollars, you can use the funds for the non-federal match for FEMA public assistance, the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. You cannot use it you cannot use the funds no matter what for the cost share of Medicaid, as well as the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. So no matter what, and then any non-revenue loss dollars, you still cannot use for the non-federal match, again, unless you're using them for these very specific surface transportation projects or CDBG programs. So now let's get into specifically the emergency relief from natural disasters. So now under the new guidance, counties can use recovery funds to provide emergency relief from natural disasters or addressing the negative economic impacts from those natural disasters. So what Treasury did is that they tried to break up this section into like 2 steps to try to make it as sort of seamless as possible. So the 2-step process is first, a county is going to have to identify a natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently, or a natural disaster that is threatened to occur in the future. So that's your first step, just identifying that natural disaster, what kind of natural disaster it is. The second is emergency relief. So you actually have to identify the emergency relief that responds to a physical or negative economic impact, or any sort of like physical or negative economic impacts of those natural disasters. A key here is, while you are identifying that emergency relief that is needed, Treasury does stress that it has to be reasonably proportional to the impact identified. So this is very similar language to what they used under their final rule, that 2022 final rule. So just calling that out there, Treasury really likes to, make sure that things are proportional to any sort of like damage experienced. So when we're taking a look at really like what step number 1 means, so right, that means identifying a natural disaster. How Treasury define natural disasters is they very much so align it with like the FEMA definition of what a natural disaster is. So as you can see, broad range, we could have hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, mudslides, fire. In addition to all of those that are listed, also it's any other natural catastrophe that's attributable to natural causes. So, they definitely stress, of course, that it can't be man-made, but this also gives you the flexibility in terms of like, okay, so say, knock on wood, God forbid we have another pandemic, but if we have like another kind of similar COVID event take place, FEMA does define that as a natural catastrophe. So that would also be covered in this as well too. So again, step 1, you just specifically identify the natural disaster that your community is either has, is about to, or will in the future. Step 2 is identifying that emergency relief. So what Treasury does here is that they do provide definitions for what emergency relief is. So how Treasury defines it is that it's assistance needed to save lives, protect property, public health or safety, and then lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe. It also has to respond, of course, as I mentioned earlier, to any sort of physical or negative economic impacts, or those potential impacts of a future natural disaster. And then just to reiterate, it has to be proportional to the damage that has been caused or will be caused. So after you have this 2-step process, or now that you know that 2-step process, there are now kind of 2 scenarios that you can apply this 2-step process to, which I know is a little bit confusing, but I'm going to walk you through it because it does make it actually easier. It makes a little bit more sense. So the 2 scenarios right here, as you can see, are A and B, which you're determining when you're like providing that emergency relief. So scenario A is the natural disaster has occurred or is expected to occur imminently. So that's that assistance that's needed to save lives, protect property, make sure, secure public health and safety. The scenario 2 is a natural disaster is expected to occur in the future. And then depending on which scenario you choose, that's ultimately going to determine the specific eligible uses that you can use the ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds for. So just as a reminder, you are applying this 2-step process to 2 different scenarios, which is going to determine what eligible uses you can use the funds for. So now let's actually kind of play this out. So how to actually implement that 2-step process. So say if there's a natural disaster that has occurred in the past, or for a fact is about to occur. So you identify that natural disaster. So it's any of like those definitions that I just reviewed, but also it could be the subject of a declaration of either a federal, state, or local disaster. So you do have that flexibility there. It doesn't have to just be a, federally declared disaster. It can be by the governor or by the county's chief executive. So you do have flexibility in that. If you're able to identify that in scenario A, then step 2 is that you then can identify your emergency relief. And so Treasury explicitly outlines what those eligible uses are if you're in this scenario. So that's any sort of like temporary emergency housing, it's food assistance, other immediate needs like debris removal, emergency protective services. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. Treasury has around, like, I would say maybe 35 to 40 eligible uses that they outline, but just to give you an idea of how broad this exactly is. So that's how you apply the 2-step process in scenario A. So now let's apply this 2-step process for scenario B. So those are the natural disasters that you expect to occur in the future, and how do you make sure that your community is prepared for those disasters? I will say this one is like a little bit more difficult. This is something that NACo is going to be commenting on in response to the interim final rule, because we absolutely love working with Treasury. They're fantastic partners, but we think that this is like a little bit more difficult than it really should be. So step 1 is identifying the natural disaster. And here's kind of like the biggest concern that NACo has, is that you have to, so say you're a county in Florida, you know that hurricane season is like September, October, and we can just say right now that it's, November. So you want to say, okay, we know that a hurricane is likely to hit in a year. So we want to make sure that we use the funds in preparation for that. So what a county would actually have to do is document that evidence of historical patterns or predictions of natural disasters that actually demonstrate the likelihood of that future disaster to occur. So what Treasury says is that county should be able to use FEMA's National Risk Index or use other information to support the county's determination that mitigation activities would help any sort of like future impact of a disaster. So the reason why there's more concern with this is that, of course, this is an administrative burden. It really does take a lot of time. Counties have different amount of resources to do this. Also, a significant amount of FEMA's data is outdated, and doesn't actually account for the reality that is today when we're talking about natural disasters. Putting that concern aside, say that a county went through this entire step 1 of identifying the natural disaster, collecting all that data, etc. Step 2 is identify the emergency relief needed. So this is all pre-disaster mitigation activities. We were really happy to see this included. NACo had sent Treasury a long list of mitigation activities that counties are responsible for providing, and so Treasury did include those. But as you can see, it's all across the board: structure elevation, dry flood proofing, wind retrofitting, etc. So all sort of mitigation activities. A lot of flexibility there. And then when we're talking about a little bit more around natural disasters, there are this is a continuation of scenario B, and how that actually plays out. So undoubtedly, there are going to be counties, when we're talking about mitigation activities, there are going to be capital expenditures or capital projects, right? So there are associated requirements with that. So again, if a county is using their state and local fiscal recovery funds for scenario B, natural disaster in the future, looking at emergency relief, so like any sort of like, let's say, structure elevation, if that capital project is greater than $1 million, what happens is that a county will be required to write a written justification for why that capital expenditure is needed. They have to justify that cost. This is, again, very similar to what counties had to do under the 2022 final rule for other capital expenditures, but it was mostly around like housing, etc., items that are under other eligible use categories. So what a county is going to have to do for this is that they will need to provide a description of the emergency relief and potential impacts to be addressed. So, they could say, we want to construct emergency housing for residents, and it will house 50 people. That's an example. Explanation of why the capital expenditure is appropriate. So like, why doesn't the county's current resources be able to like supplement this specific project that needs to be done? And then also comparing the capital expenditure that the county wants to use recovery funds for against two other proposals that are less costly, and why this capital expenditure that the county's trying to do is superior. So those are a couple of items that a county will be required to do. Treasury is not providing any sort of pre-approval. They're continuing that from the 2022 final rule. Simply what a county has to do is just demonstrate that the funds are needed in this way and move forward. Also related to emergency relief is that there are a lot of requirements, limitations around duplication of benefits. So when you're using these funds within this eligible use category, you have to abide by the Stafford Act, which means that there's a prohibition on duplication of benefits. So what this means is that a county is not allowed to provide financial assistance to a person, a business, or other entity for disaster losses when they are actually receiving financial assistance under another federal program. So if you know that a person is receiving federal assistance under another program because of a disaster, you absolutely cannot provide benefits to that person. You are allowed to provide benefits to a person that has not received federal benefits, but if you find out down the line that they did receive benefits, that individual actually has to pay the county back as well. So again, just making sure that you're avoiding any sort of duplication. And similarly, this is the timeline in terms of expenditures and obligation. As I mentioned, continuing to obligate by December 31st, 2024. That's the same as the final rule. And then expending the dollars by December 31st of 2026. Again, same as the 2022 final rule. So now let's move on to surface transportation and those Title I projects. So before getting into the surface transportation section, I wanted to talk about the limitations both for the surface transportation and Title I projects, because Treasury does group them together. So there are requirements that counties have to follow. So first is the limitation of recovery fund contribution towards surface transportation and those Title I CDBG projects. So what Treasury decided to do here is that the total amount of recovery funds that a county can use for surface transportation and those CDBG eligible projects combined cannot exceed $10 million or 30% of a county's total recovery fund allocation. So what you would have to do is, say you decide to take the 30% because it's higher than 10 million, and even the 10 million too. If you want to use the funds for both transportation and CDBG projects, you would just have to weigh them between one another. Maybe say if you have 10 million, maybe you want to use $7 million for surface transportation and $3 million for CDBG related or CDBG eligible projects. It just simply has to add up. It cannot exceed that 10 million or the 30% if the county chooses to do the 30%. So just make sure that nothing is going over those thresholds. The other limitation is all around supplementing versus supplanting funds. So when we're talking about surface transportation and CDBG projects, counties can only supplement other like federal, state, tribal, local governments for certain programs and projects. They cannot supplant. So what that means is when you're supplementing, so say a project is already being funded, you're in a contract with, you're receiving a federal grant for a project, you already have a contract. If there are unforeseen costs that come about, so say like because of inflation, resources, etc., you can use the state and local fiscal recovery funds to contribute towards that project for those unforeseen costs. However, now that these are eligible uses, what you cannot do is say you've already entered into a contract with a federal agency for a federal grant. You cannot say, oh, hey, just kidding. Actually, now this is an eligible use. So I'm going to back out of this contract and use the recovery funds for that. So that is strictly prohibited. The third limitation or requirement is that, of course, you have to comply with other existing laws. So specifically calling out the National Environmental Policy Act, that's NEPA. So all those like environmental reviews you have to comply with, as well as Title I of the Housing and Development Act, which is CDBG. And then, as I mentioned multiple times before, obligation deadlines. Obligation deadline is the same. Expenditure deadline is that new September 30th of 2026. So now let's move on specifically to talking about surface transportation projects. So what Treasury did, similar to kind of like the disaster relief section, is that they separated the projects into 3 categories. So Pathway 1, Pathway 2, Pathway 3. Pathway 1 are projects that are already receiving funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation, and you are just simply supplementing those, again, like incurred costs, additional incurred costs that were not foreseen with these state and local fiscal recovery funds. Pathway 2 are surface transportation projects that are not receiving any funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And then Pathway 3 is satisfying that non-federal match requirements for certain transportation projects and using the recovery funds for that. So let's talk about Pathway 1. So again, just to reiterate, these are projects that are receiving funding from US DOT. Under the new guidance, counties can use recovery funds for 26 different programs that are administered by the Department of Transportation that are either currently receiving funding or will receive funding by December 31st of 2024. In terms of those eligible uses, you can expand or enhance those existing DOT projects, cover those unexpected costs, and then fund projects that are not currently funded by US DOT. What's a little bit different than other sections of this, for the Pathway 1 projects, US DOT will have oversight of these projects. So you will be working directly with the US Department of Transportation, because what Treasury did is that they aligned with other federal programs that are happening right now. So that's US DOT's expertise. The county will be working with US DOT to make sure that they're in compliance. I won't go through all of these, but simply this just demonstrates all of the new eligible programs, projects under this new eligible use category. So as you can see, a ton of programs. Now moving on to Pathway 2 projects. So to reiterate, these are not projects that are not currently receiving funding from the Department of Transportation. Now this kind of comes into play, another kind of 2-step process similar to the disaster relief section. So we're under Pathway 2. And what Treasury did is that they created 2 different frameworks for what they are saying is eligible, and then also what are the associated requirements with it. So streamlined framework, I'll say this is definitely the easier way to go. The streamlined framework, these are the eligible uses, which include any projects that qualify for a US DOT RAISE program grant. So if you're doing a streamlined framework project, you are not required to obtain US Treasury approval prior to using the funds for these projects, because they already know that they're eligible because they're already part of an existing federal program. These projects are also not subject to NEPA environmental review requirements. And again, this is because a lot more flexibility, way easier for streamlined framework. This is because Treasury deems these projects as less costly and more compliant because they're already eligible under that RAISE program. For projects that are outside of the streamlined framework, we're going to call it the regular framework. Treasury hasn't come up with an actual name for it yet, but these are a little bit more difficult. These are the higher risk projects, more costly. Treasury will design a future process for counties that are seeking to use recovery funds for these projects, and they're using the public comment period to decide what that looks like. And these projects are subject to NEPA requirements as well. For Pathway 2 projects, these are eligible projects under the RAISE grant program. Obviously, there are a ton more, but just wanted to give you all a snapshot. So it's highway, bridge, public transit, port infrastructure, intermodal projects. If you scan that QR code, it'll take you to the 2023 RAISE grant notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO, and that lists out all of the specific eligible projects under the RAISE program. In terms of the requirements associated with Pathway 2, so again, you have to comply with all federal program requirements. This is wage and labor requirements, like Davis-Bacon Act requirements, procurement requirements. If any sort of project is only funded by state and local fiscal recovery funds, it's not subject to NEPA as well. So these are the projects, just to get down into like more of the weeds, these are those projects that are outside of the streamline framework. So these projects that are not under the streamline framework, what they include are, they're not RAISE grant programs. So any, like a project outside of the RAISE program, they're above $10 million in terms of actually like investing those funds. And it includes activities that do not fall within the categorical exclusions. So if a county ends up choosing, we want to go do a service transportation project that is not under the streamline framework, we really want to do this, you are going to have to receive approval from Treasury. You have to submit something called a notice of intent, and you send it to that email right there on the screen, and you actually have to send it 30 days after the end of the interim final rule comment period. And this is simply what is included in the notice of intent. I'm not going to go all through it, but it's project description, the total expected project cost, the status of the NEPA review, how the county plans to comply with Buy America requirements. So a lot of additional information is required that you have to submit to Treasury. And then finally, those Pathway 3 projects, these are those projects that you can use the non-federal these are the projects that you can use the funds for non-federal match requirements. So these are just a couple of examples. It's the Infrastructure for Rebuilding America grants. So that's like freight and highway projects, fixed skyway capital investment grants, mega grants, and then projects that are eligible for credit assistance under the TIFIA program. So a lot of like railway, freight, highway, transit, all of those, you can use them for the non-federal match requirements. And then finally, these are the program requirements specifically for those Pathway 3 projects. So what counties have to do is that you have to consult with the Department of Transportation prior to using the recovery funds for any non-federal match projects. So it's very similar to what counties have to do under like other, traditional transportation projects when you're using federal funds. You also, of course, have to comply with requirements associated with all the other programs, unless otherwise stated by the Department of Transportation. You have to use all of the same reporting requirements as well too. And then counties are expected, in addition to working with USDOT, you also have to work with Treasury on other additional reporting requirements as well. And then finally, again, this is simply just to outline the new expenditure deadline, which, as we all know, as I mentioned earlier, is September 30th of 2026. So 3 months earlier than December 31st, 2026. And then finally, just to kind of wrap it up, the last section are those Title I CDBG eligible projects. As you can see here, I'm not going to read all through this, but what it really does, it really aligns with pretty much any eligible project under CDBG is going to be eligible now under this new guidance. So you can see all of these eligible uses here. I won't go through those. I will also say that there are a handful of activities that are not eligible under the Title I CDBG program, and therefore are not eligible under this specific reporting or eligible use category. So I want to stress that even though Treasury says in their interim final rule, this version of their guidance, that these bullet points on the left side are ineligible uses, that does not mean at all whatsoever that they're completely ineligible. So a lot of these bullets are actually eligible in other categories. So for example, purchasing of equipment, we know that that is an eligible use in negative economic impacts and addressing public health impacts as well too. Another one, new housing construction. We know that's also eligible in addressing negative economic impacts. So just want to stress, if you're going to see that in the overview of the interim final rule, but they are definitely eligible elsewhere. And then just last two slides here. So in terms of requirements for these Title I CDBG projects, you will have to comply with the HUD CDBG Title I requirements and associated regulations. So for example, the primary objective, you have to direct at least 70% of your recovery funds used for Title I projects that benefit low and moderate income individuals. You also, of course, have to comply with NEPA. Each project has to satisfy at least one CDBG national objective. You have to comply with Davis-Bacon Act requirements as well, too. So there are a number of requirements that you have to meet as well. And then finally, there are some pre-approval requirements specifically for these projects. You have to comply with NEPA, you have to submit a project certification to Treasury, and then you also will receive approval from Treasury for these funds as well, too. And finally, again, this expedited expenditure deadline of September 30th of 2026 for these Title I CDBG projects. And before I move on, just want to make sure that folks are aware that the public comment period is open. So if you scan that QR code, it'll take you directly there, and comments are due in early December. So now, just to close out the presentation, wanted to quickly touch on funding the federal government and then the Waters of the United States regulation that I mentioned. So I'm sure all of you saw all of the media coverage around the government shutdown and how Congress was able to pass a short-term funding bill to avert that shutdown at the end of September, which goes until November 17th. So we're just a month out now at this point. So not only did that short-term spending bill just like continue to maintain current funding levels, it also provides $16 billion for FEMA's disaster relief fund, which you all likely saw that the FEMA administrator made a statement that the disaster relief fund was running out of money and the agency could only fund any sort of like response services that were life-threatening, life-sustaining, or critical services. So they were dwindling down on that money. So this funding package was able to allocate $15.5 billion for that disaster relief fund. It also ensured that the Department of Agriculture can maintain the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for women, infants, and children. That's also WIC. That was going to have catastrophic impacts if Congress was not able to address that, kicking many families off of that really critical program. It also extends the authorization of the National Flood Insurance Program through November 17th of 2023, because that expired on September 30th. And then it also provides an extension of the statutory authorities for the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, through December 30th of 2023, because that also expired on September 30th as well, too. One thing that is still not being dealt with is the Farm Bill reauthorization. The Farm Bill expired on September 30th. It's looking like, honestly, realistically, with everything that's going on, we probably won't have a Farm Bill until I would say like maybe March or April of 2024. So significantly behind in those negotiations, but that was of course not included. So now, with only a month left, what Congress has to decide is we have to, are we going to do a short-term funding bill? That's looking much more likely. And how do we reach consensus by November 17th? So as you all, I'm sure saw, the House decided to vote then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy of California out as Speaker. And now there has been a lot of back and forth in terms of who will become the next speaker, who has the votes. So it was originally Representative Steve Scalise. He's kind of like the number 2 to Kevin McCarthy. Of course, last Thursday, he announced that he was pulling out of the race. And so now it's Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, who is the front runner. They might be doing a vote today. As of this morning, Congressman Jordan was down by 10 votes. So ultimately what this means is without a Speaker of the House, nothing is able to get done in terms of passing bills. So ultimately, if Representative Jordan is elected as Speaker of the House, there is a tight timeline in terms of the House being able to negotiate with the Senate as well as the White House and try to pass some sort of bipartisan funding deal. And that QR code, that simply outlines a lot of the FAQs in terms of like, so say if there's a government shutdown happens, what sort of like federal programs are ongoing, are counties reimbursed for the services that they're providing, et cetera. And then also like the specific county impacts too. And then just to finish it out, waters of the United States. So waters of the US, this is, or WOTUS for short, this is a term that was used in the Clean Water Act. So what that term is actually, it determines like what waters and their conveyances fall under federal jurisdiction as opposed to state permitting authority. So what it really does is that it really kind of monitors like how pollution goes throughout our waters, what are the impacts, who's responsible for any sort of pollution in these like specific sort of waters. So it's specifically like navigable waters. So WOTUS, it was not defined under the Clean Water Act. So what's been happening since the 80s is that the Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers have been responsible for actually defining what a WOTUS is. So many, in the 80s, EPA and the Army Corps defined WOTUS to include all waters and wetlands that use degradation or deconstruction that could affect the interstate or foreign commerce. So since the 80s, there has been a lot of back and forth, a lot of court cases, as well as different definitions of what a WOTUS is as administrations are flipping. So the most recent items that have happened is that the Biden administration had released their final rule of waters of the US earlier this year, back in January. There was a court case that was filed. It's called Sackett v. EPA. It was just a family that actually had submitted this case. And so what happened is that it rose to the level of the Supreme Court. And so ultimately what was up in the air was, how do we define what a WOTUS is? Should it include a wetland? Should it include like adjacent waters? And it was using this thing called the federal nexus test, which the Biden administration era WOTUS rule did use. It used the significant nexus test, which ultimately what that did is that it expanded the scope of which waters were federally regulated. So what happened with this Supreme Court case is that ultimately the court rejected that significant nexus test and indicated adjacent wetlands constitute WOTUS, and the court interpreted adjacent narrowly, meaning adjoining. So ultimately what that means is that there is a narrower interpretation of WOTUS, which has led to less local government infrastructure that is covered also by this definition of WOTUS. So what EPA had to do is that they had to go back, rewrite their final rule, and completely eliminate any reference to the significant nexus test, which is what they did. They did release a new rule back in August, at the very end of August, I think it was August 28th, that did definitely narrow the scope. NACo is still trying to receive a little bit more clarification on exactly like what the county impact is. Is all county infrastructure excluded, or is it not? So we're trying to get a little bit more information around that, but ultimately it absolutely narrows the scope of what the previous rule did as well too. So this impacts counties all across the country, and we're continuing to come out with a lot more information on that. So those are just a couple of updates that I wanted to provide folks with. Really appreciate you all bearing with me. I know that's a lot of information and a lot of time. So happy to take any questions if folks have them. If they don't now, I can also drop my email into the chat. And you can definitely feel free to reach out offline too. But with that, Nancy, I will turn it back over to you. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Eryn. Such a concise and clear set of information today. I'm going to give folks a moment to put some questions into the chat that they might be thinking of. But I want to ask you if you want to give any sort of comment on what you feel really are some of the biggest changes since the last time that we all kind of looked at the guidance in years past, these recent years, and maybe what do you feel counties really should be paying attention to in terms of the new information, but also some of the impacts that are going to be sort of more widely apparent?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nancy. Just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, is you're asking like what like the major differences between this new guidance and like previous guidance from Treasury is?
Yes, but also just sort of, you did give us quite a bit of information and wanting at this time for you to emphasize where you think is important is, for Illinois counties to really pay attention
Yeah,
to the requirements. Yes.
yeah. So I think that I think like so I would say, and I should have probably touched on this. I think the biggest item that we're kind of focused on regarding the state and local fiscal recovery fund is now that we're kind of getting up to that December 31st, 2024 expenditure deadline, or excuse me, obligation deadline, is that we have gone back and forth a lot with Treasury around providing a more clear definition of what obligation means. I think when Treasury was setting up the program, they were really trying to provide recipients with more flexibility with that 2-year period, but they didn't really necessarily account for the fact that counties operate on an annual budget cycle. So giving them 2 years isn't really helpful. Like in this context, since you can't budget 2 years out. So something that NACo's really been working on, and we've been reaching out to counties about asking for their support, and Senators Duckworth and Durbin, of course, of Illinois, are on board with this, is getting a better definition of obligation to make sure that counties can take full advantage of that 2-year period, as well as actually extending the obligation deadline back to 2025 instead of 2024. So that's just something that we have absolutely been working on our side, especially now that this new guidance is out. It was really, really delayed. It was supposed to come out February of 2023. It didn't come out until August 10th of 2023. So, that additional year would definitely allow counties for the more flexibility to make sure that they're investing the funds in these really great new eligible use categories without, being met with like challenges around NEPA and other items too. So I think that that's probably worth mentioning, that that's something that we're working on and very much so focused on.
Thank you. And folks, I'm not seeing very many questions. It's certainly fine to just sort of take in the information, and I will be giving folks the slides that you are providing to me, and the recording as well. So some of the folks who are interested in attending today can review, who might not have been able to be here live with us. So that will be great. We do have one question that just popped in wanting to look at the MIPA abbreviation, if you could explain what that meant.
Oh, I don't I don't know, but I'm not sure if I said MIPA. That's not. Oh, NEPA. Yes, NEPA, maybe NEPA. NEPA, yes, sorry, Chris. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA, it's like a requirement for environmental review that counties have to go through. So say if they want to do like any sort of project, they actually have to comply with federal environmental review process, which is NEPA. Oftentimes that takes anywhere from like 2, 3 or more years. So it is very, very timely. So that like very much so like delays a lot of the larger capital projects that counties are doing, especially under the new eligible use categories. So that's something that we're very cognizant of, which is another reason as to why we're trying to push back that obligation deadline.
Yeah, and earlier on you were talking about funds covering natural disasters, and that was a really good set of information in terms of the recovery and the recent budget sort of bridge that we've got going on right now.
Yeah.
But there is some concern. I did receive a question in a direct message from a participant today. There is some concern on whether or not the natural disaster has to necessarily occur, or if any of the funds can be allocated or planned for in terms of disaster preparedness.
Yeah, so those mitigation activities, those are exactly what Treasury is hoping that counties will use those funds for. So like any sort of like, you know, any sort of like preparedness activities that fall under those eligible uses, you definitely can use that for them to make sure that you know are fully prepared prior to any sort of future disaster that would occur.
Sure. And I know, here in Illinois, especially within our local governments, the county governments and whatnot, we did have quite a bit of turnover, and people are really trying to wrap their heads around, all of the different ins and outs of the guidance and the possibilities for
Yeah.
these funds. And so it's great that you guys have such a comprehensive website with those resources online as well. What are some of your frequent questions that you're getting these days? Because I can imagine that there's some other sort of similar environments in other states with newly elected officials and folks, coming on and trying to get a handle on how to manage.
Yeah, I think some of the biggest questions right now, I mean, the ton of questions that I'm receiving are like about like the obligation deadline and what are you supposed to do if between that 2-year period, so say you like over obligate funds and there's one program that you don't need, that you thought you were going to need a lot of money for, you end up not, but there's another program or project that it does exceed costs that you would allocate it for. Like, can you over obligate and intermingle those funds and like switch them over and like, or I guess like reallocate after the obligation deadline? So that's a question that we've received a lot. Also, in terms of like reporting for the state and local fiscal recovery fund, how exactly do you go about doing that, accounting for like use of funds, what is the relationship between like a county and a subrecipient look like, and what's required of subrecipients. So it's really kind of all over the board. Also receiving a lot of questions around like non-federal match requirements, or even like state match requirements for different projects as well too. So it really is, a broad set of questions. I would say mostly right now, a lot of questions around like obligation deadlines and what to do post deadline.
Thank you. And so do you have, I think this is actually really relevant, just having heard some of the counties come forward over the past months, just speaking with folks, and how there really are going to have to turn over and as you say, the intermingle the obligations and turn it into something that can help another budget item that exceeded cost. And so is that do you have like a very sort of specific little hack that within the reporting requirements that would be easily reported or easily done?
So with that, I will say, so not exactly like a hack for the reporting, but I do want to mention though around the obligation issue. We know that Treasury is going to be releasing additional guidance. We don't know if it's going to be like an FAQ or just like a totally different supplemental document where they are going to be outlining or they're going to be providing answers to specific questions around what's the definition of obligation. If you come into a scenario where you have to reallocate dollars post obligation deadline, how do you go about doing that? Is that allowed? So Treasury spoke at one of our conferences what was last week? Yeah, I think maybe, yeah, last week, 2 weeks ago, sorry, 2 weeks ago. And she did say that they would be releasing guidance on this within the next month. So we're hoping that will clarify a lot of questions that we've been having.
That's great. We'll keep on the lookout for that and make sure to kind of maybe couple that with this education. So we really thank you. We're nearing the noon hour. I really want to thank folks for coming on. Want to thank Eryn Hurley again. You are always excellent and providing us with the great information that we really need to learn about, and we hope you'll come back next time. Want to tell everybody that if they could quickly click on their screen to let us know if you felt like you had an increase in knowledge and you learned something new today with regards to the new Treasury guidance and the budget impacts and eligible uses, etc. Thank you again, Eryn. Behalf of University of Illinois Extensions and Rural Partners, thank you for being here today. And we hope
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone for coming on. Have a good rest of your week.